Hello, and welcome to Chapter 16, Slavery Divides the Nation. Just like our previous discussions, we were looking at the time period between 1820 to around 1860, 1861. Well, in this chapter, we'll also be looking at that time period, but we'll be focusing in on slavery because this is the chapter where everything is leading up to the Civil War. So we're going to be looking at slavery and its impact on the United States, and ultimately how this debate over free and slave states and how that ultimately would result in the Civil War starting in 1861. So for today, in our introductory lesson, we're going to be talking about a figure that may be familiar to you. You may have heard his name once or twice, but wanted to give a little bit of backlog on the early life of Abraham Lincoln and how that prepared him to lead the United States. And there he is. You recognize this guy? Here's a hint. He only attended school for 1 year, but eventually, through hard work and perseverance, became the 16th President of the United States. So if you guessed, hey, that looks a lot like Abraham Lincoln, well, you were correct. And this particular picture of Lincoln was from around 1847. So in the picture, he was 37 years old. And it is the oldest known photograph of the man who would eventually come to be known as the Great Emancipator. But we will get to that later. Lincoln was born on the Kentucky frontier in 1809 and lived there until he was 7 years old in a log cabin similar to the one we're looking at right here. But unfortunately, his father never filled out the proper paperwork to own the land they were living on, so in 1816 they were forced to move across the river into the Indiana Territory. And it was there that young Abraham developed a love of learning, and he would practice his writing all over any available surface in their small but very sturdy log cabin with a piece of charcoal. In these pictures, you can see him reading by firelight or practicing his writing, and he's actually practicing it on a coal shovel because, like I said, he would take whatever surface he could find and use that to practice his writing, and he would practice his reading by firelight. Now, just before he turned 10, his mother passed away from a very common illness of the time known as milk sickness. He had been very, very close to his mother, and her death pushed the young Abraham Lincoln into two things that would really prepare him for his future: reading and hard work. He had only 1 year of formal schooling, but on his own had developed a love of reading and a love of learning. He read and reread Aesop's Fables, the Arabian Nights, and the Bible, among other things. But when he was 12, he found an autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and it was this book that had a very profound influence on him. And we've talked about Franklin in the past, how he was an inventor, a statesman, and one of the founding fathers of the United States. But what interested Lincoln the most was that Franklin grew up poor, but was able to, through hard work and perseverance, work his way out of poverty with ingenuity and determination, both of which are qualities that the young Abraham Lincoln had in an enormous supply. So as we start into this chapter about slavery and its effect on the United States, we're going to be discussing the final sets of events that would ultimately plunge the United States into the Civil War. And many historians say that the proverbial, quote, straw that broke the camel's back was the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States. And we're not going to get to Lincoln's election until the very end of this chapter, but I want you to keep in mind that this was a man that at one time was a young man who learned that the keys to changing your station or the keys to changing your class level in life are hard work and education. And our video for today, it's about 25 minutes long, but it's going to go into more detail about the early life of Abraham Lincoln, his early political struggles, and it will end with talking about his presidential campaign. So in about 25 minutes or so, we're going to get into the assignment for today, but the video is going to really help you get a better understanding of who Abraham Lincoln was, the things that he had to overcome, and the ways that he overcame those obstacles to ultimately run for the presidency.
Abraham Lincoln came from modest beginnings. His family and his surroundings were typical of people living in the wilderness in the early 1800s. He was named after his grandfather Abraham, who was married to Bathsheba Herring. Abraham and Bathsheba had 5 children: Mordecai, Josiah, Thomas, May, and Nancy. Thomas was the future president's father. As Thomas ventured out on his own, he traveled around Kentucky working at odd jobs. Sometimes he did carpentry, and sometimes farming. On June 12, 1806, Thomas married Nancy Hanks. After their marriage, they lived in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where their first child, Sarah, was born. Tom decided to combine his trade of carpentry with farming and moved on to a farm close by. There, on February 12, 1809, Abraham was born. The future president was born in a log cabin that had 1 room, 1 window, and 1 door. Abe and his sister Sarah traveled 4 miles a day to attend school. Because of their chores on the farm, they were not able to go to school regularly, but they did manage to learn the alphabet and read some basic vocabulary. In 1816, Thomas decided to move to Indiana. The family traveled north from Kentucky and crossed the Ohio River into Spencer County, Indiana. They built their new home on 160 acres near a small town called Gentryville. Their cabin was modest, and they farmed mostly corn. Abe started to go to school again and learned more of the basics of reading and writing. Education was important to Nancy Lincoln. Abe related to friends many years later that his formal schooling amounted to approximately 1 year. A notebook of Abe's worksheets contained this poem: "Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, and he will be good, but God knows when." Nancy Lincoln died in 1818, which left Thomas Lincoln to care for his children. The tasks of running the farm and being both mother and father was overwhelming to Tom. In December 1819, he returned to Elizabethtown and proposed marriage to a widow, Sally Bush Johnston. They were married the following morning. Sally loved the Lincoln children as her own and had a very positive influence in young Abe's life. The boy grew quickly and was 6 feet 4 inches tall while he was still in his teens. He was extremely strong, and stories were told of his feats of strength. He could sink an axe deeper into a log than any man in the county. Abe continued to educate himself by borrowing books. Years later, Dennis Hanks told friends, "I never seen Abe after he was 12 that he didn't have a book somewhere around." During these years, Abe developed his abilities as a storyteller and politician. He worked hard on his public speaking and would practice on anyone who was willing to listen. At the age of 18, Abraham left home to work as a ferryman's helper on the Ohio River. At first, he took passengers from Bates Landing out to the steamboats in midstream. After a while, he sailed to New Orleans with a flatboat full of cargo. It was on this trip that Lincoln earned his first dollar. In 1830, Thomas Lincoln moved his family again. Abe drove the wagon carrying their belongings to their new home in Macon County, Illinois, near Decatur. Abe worked with his father until the family was settled, and then he started out on his own. The adventures of being an adult were before him, and Abe was anxious to make his place in the world. He needed a job and met Denton Offert, who was sending a cargo of merchandise to New Orleans. He hired Lincoln, John Hanks, and John Johnston to run the boat. He paid them 50 cents a day, with a bonus of $20 if the trip was successful. After the trip was completed, Denton opened a general store in New Salem, Illinois, and offered Abe a job. Lincoln worked in the store and liked the idea of being a merchant because it gave him time to read. It was during this time that he grew to love Shakespeare and Burns. Abe had an ability for storytelling, so the store had a constant flow of people coming by to chat. Mentor Graham was the schoolmaster in New Salem. Abe confided in him that he was self-conscious about his appearance and that he had no formal education. He told him he had dreams of having a political career. Graham offered to tutor Lincoln in the evenings. There are some anecdotes connected with his work in the store which show us how he came to be called Honest Abe. One night, he was counting the store's cash at closing time, and he discovered that he had charged a customer 6 cents too much. He closed the store at once and walked to the home of the customer and returned the money. Another time, he realized that he had mistakenly given a customer 4 ounces of tea instead of the 8 they paid for. He again closed the store and took them the other 4 ounces. When Abe was 23 years old, the store went out of business, and he needed to find a new job. He bought a half interest in another store, the other half owned by a man named Berry. The store was not very successful, so when some strangers came to town and offered to buy it, Abe and Berry accepted and took promissory notes as payment. About the time the last notes came due, the new owners disappeared. Berry had died, and Lincoln was left with the obligation to pay off a debt of $1,100. He promised to put all his earnings in excess of modest living expenses into paying back the sum. Lincoln called it the national debt, and it took him 15 years to repay it all. Abe was distraught over these debts, and friends told how they caused him to go into deep depressions. Depression plagued Lincoln for the rest of his life. In the fall of 1833, Abe was looking for a new profession and decided to become a surveyor. He was appointed surveyor of Sangamon County, and in 6 weeks taught himself the basic principles. He had a difficult time making a living at surveying and was appointed postmaster in New Salem. Because there wasn't very much mail, he was able to carry the letters that needed to be delivered inside his hat. His branch office was closed after a short time, but no agent of the government came to settle the accounts. Years later, when Lincoln was in Springfield, a post office representative appeared and demanded the balance due to the United States Post Office. The amount was the huge sum of $17 and a few cents. A friend of Lincoln's who knew that he was short of funds offered to loan him the money. Abe said, "Hold on a minute, and let's see how we come out." He went to his room and returned with an old rag containing money. The amount in the rag was exactly what he owed the post office. Lincoln decided to enter politics. Because of his jobs as a shopkeeper and postmaster, he knew virtually everyone in the area. He was aware of the needs of the community, and his platform reflected the concerns of the voters. Abe suffered his first election defeat. He got most of the votes of people who lived near town, but lost the votes from people in the outlying regions where he was not so well known. In 1834, he tried for political office again by running for the state legislature. He ran on the platform of the Whig Party and was backed by a Springfield lawyer named John Todd Stewart. This time, he won easily, and the election was a turning point in Abraham Lincoln's life. He bought his first suit and left on the 75-mile trip to the Illinois state capitol, then located at Vandalia. He arrived on a snowy day in December. The legislature had begun a special session on December 7th. Illinois lawmakers earned only $3 a day while the legislature was in session. Once again, Lincoln found himself struggling to take care of his minimal needs and pay his debts from the general store. Stuart encouraged Lincoln to study to become a lawyer. In those days, you didn't have to attend a university to become an attorney. You only had to pass the examinations. Lincoln was ambitious and was convinced that if he wanted to move up the political ladder, he needed to become an attorney. Stuart offered to lend him the books he needed. He was admitted to the bar in 1837. During his second term in the legislature, the state capital moved from Vandalia to Springfield, and he joined John Stuart's law firm as a junior partner. Joshua Speed, a merchant in Springfield, offered him a place to stay. Speed's store was a popular meeting spot for the town's bachelors. It was a place to socialize, tell stories, and argue politics. Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat who opposed Lincoln's Whig platform, came to Speed's regularly, and this was the start of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Springfield was mostly populated by people who had some formal education and enjoyed cultural gatherings. Lincoln was always a popular guest among the men, but he was never able to master the art of small talk with women and seemed uncomfortable around them. Into this society came a pretty, bright, educated, cultured young lady of 21, Miss Mary Todd. Lincoln was in awe of her polished manners and her ability to speak and write French. But to some people she seemed temperamental and opinionated, characteristics that would cause Lincoln problems throughout his political career. In 1840, Lincoln and Mary Todd announced their engagement. Mary's family told her that she was marrying beneath her, but Mary believed that Lincoln was headed for great things and stood by her decision to marry Abe. The opposition to the marriage by Mary's family threw Lincoln into a depression, and he broke off the engagement. He had doubts as to whether he could deal with the responsibility of marriage. Lincoln struggled with his depression and stayed in his room for a week. 15 months later, Lincoln and Mary Todd were reunited by Mrs. Simeon Francis, wife of the editor of the Springfield Journal. They quickly renewed their romance and were married on the evening of November 4th, 1842. Lincoln was 33 years old and Mary was 23. They started out their marriage living above the Globe Tavern. Their first son, Robert, was born in August 1843. Shortly after his birth, Mary's father loaned them $1,500 to buy the home which they lived in for the next 17 years. Their 3 younger sons, Edward, William, and Thomas, were born in this house. Since his younger days, when he had traveled to New Orleans and saw the atrocities of slavery firsthand, Lincoln had been committed to the abolishment of slavery. In southern states, it was against the law to speak against slavery. But in the North, it was not, and Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated the issue many times. Lincoln would take on legal cases for no fee when he felt that slaves were receiving unfair treatment. His law firm prospered, and he built a reputation as a fair attorney who dedicated himself to winning all his cases. On February 16, 1846, Lincoln received his party's nomination for Congress. He ran against Peter Cartwright, a revivalist preacher. Lincoln was again elected by a large majority. Abe, Mary, and their children arrived in Washington in 1847. Life in Washington was disappointing for Mary. After a few months, she took the children and went to live with her parents in Kentucky. Abe missed his family deeply and wrote them regularly. In May of 1846, Congress declared war on Mexico. By the time Lincoln took his seat in Congress, the war was virtually over. The United States was already negotiating for the acquisition of today's states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The Whig Party was opposed to the war, and Lincoln expressed his opposition early in his term. Many politicians openly accused President James K. Polk's administration of starting the war in order to obtain the Mexican territory. Lincoln was very vocal about his belief that this was the case, and he introduced a series of resolutions attempting to force the president to admit that the United States, not Mexico, was the aggressor. His position on the war caused him a great deal of political harm. He was ridiculed in the Washington press, and in his home state of Illinois, he was very unpopular for taking the anti-war stand. There were no hardline slavery issues proposed during Lincoln's term in Congress. All in all, Lincoln's 2-year term was a disappointment. He was unpopular, ineffective, and missed his family. The Lincoln family was reunited, and they went back to Springfield, where Lincoln practiced law with William Herndon. From 1849 to 1854, he traveled extensively, and his popularity began to increase again. In February 1850, 4-year-old Edward Lincoln died after a 2-month illness. As a result, Mary had a nervous breakdown and spent weeks at a time in her room. Lincoln had to take care of his wife as well as maintain his law practice. By 1850, there was a strong division between the northern and southern states over the issue of slavery. Slavery had a tremendous economic impact on the whole country. Slave labor was important to the United States economy. Many people were afraid to change this structure and were willing to overlook the gross injustices that countless blacks had to endure. The delicate balance between the North and South was continually reworked in compromises such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It said that Missouri would come into the Union as a slave state, but that slavery would be excluded from all the territory west of that state and north of its boundary forever. In 1854, Stephen Douglas worked hard to help pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise caused a great deal of discussion throughout the country. There were people for slavery and people against slavery, and surprisingly, there were many people who were not opposed to slavery itself, but were opposed to its extension into new states. Illinois was a state divided. The northern part of the state was opposed to slavery, while the southern part of the state was mostly populated by people who favored slavery. Lincoln was concerned that the nation was beginning a legislative trend which would allow states to decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery or not. The Whig Party's position was not strong enough for Lincoln. Lincoln's ability as a politician, his growing fame as a lawyer and public speaker, and his well-known anti-slavery position singled him out as the best person to answer the pro-slavery speeches of Stephen Douglas. The first in the series of debates was held at the Illinois State Fair in Springfield. Lincoln said at the outset that he did not want to present anything but the truth, and that if he said anything that was not true, he would be glad to have Douglas correct him at once. Douglas, with his customary shrewdness, took advantage of this offer by making frequent interruptions, which broke Lincoln's train of thought. Finally, Lincoln's patience ran out. He paused in his argument to say, "Gentlemen, I cannot afford to spend my time in quibbles. I take the responsibility of asserting the truth myself, relieving Judge Douglas from the necessity of his impertinent corrections." This silenced Douglas, and he spoke without further interruptions to the end of his speech, which was 3 hours and 10 minutes long. The effect of the speech on the crowd was tremendous. This was the beginning of Lincoln's rise to the presidency. For the next 2 years, Lincoln continued to speak out against slavery. He made a major address at the convention called to organize the Republican Party. He spoke to the group on May 29, 1856. His speech riveted the crowd. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, started to take notes for Lincoln during the speech, but stopped. I attempted for about 15 minutes to take notes, as was usual with me then, but at the end of that time I threw pen and paper away and lived only in the inspiration of the hour. It was at this convention that the Republican Party was born. In 1858, the U.S. senatorial term of Stephen Douglas was about to expire. He decided to run again and was the candidate of his party. The new Republican Party in Illinois turned to Lincoln. Their convention was held in Springfield, and Lincoln was nominated as the candidate for the Senate. When he addressed the convention, his opening words were, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated, with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to the slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. The House divided speech was an important speech which Douglas could not ignore. Lincoln wrote Douglas a letter proposing a series of joint debates. Douglas was far from enthusiastic, but agreed to do 7 debates. Douglas was known as the Little Giant because he was just over 5 feet tall. Abe was 6 feet 4 inches tall. In spite of their physical differences, their styles of oratory were both forceful. A woman who attended a debate said afterward, "I can recall only one fact of the debate, that I felt so sorry for Lincoln while Douglas was speaking, and then so sorry for Douglas while Lincoln was speaking." Each debate was 3 hours long, and they were held on 7 different evenings. Douglas manipulated Lincoln in the first debate. His first question began, "I desire to know whether Lincoln stands today as he did in 1854 in favor of." Douglas then quoted from the platform of a convention which Lincoln had not attended and had nothing to do with. Lincoln prepared a number of questions for the next debate. One read as follows: "Can the people of a United States territory in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?" If this were answered no, it would alienate the citizens of Illinois. If it were answered yes, it would alienate the Democrats of the South. On the way to the debate, he met a group of friends and asked for their advice. When he read the question to them, they advised him to delete it, saying, "If you do ask it, you can never be senator." To which Lincoln replied, "Gentlemen, I am killing larger game. If Douglas answers, he can never be president, and the Battle of 1860 is worth 100 of this." It is doubtful that Lincoln expected to be the presidential nominee of the Republican Party in 1860, but he did see the danger of electing Douglas to the presidency. He was willing to surrender the senatorial election to save the country from a Douglas administration. The prediction proved true. Lincoln lost the senatorial seat. Douglas lost the presidency. Up to this point, Lincoln had no desire to be president, but he did want to be elected to the United States Senate. He planned to run for the Senate again in 1862. But in 1860, at the Illinois Republican Convention, Lincoln's name was placed in nomination to be a presidential candidate. The Republican National Convention met in Chicago on May 16, 1860. The most prominent candidate for the nomination was William H. Seward of New York. He had had a long political career, and it seemed a foregone conclusion that he would be nominated. The next most prominent name was Lincoln's. As a favorite son, he had the votes of the whole Illinois delegation. He began to be seen as Seward's rival. There was a great deal of political maneuvering among the delegates, and Lincoln was nominated on the 3rd ballot. Hannibal Hamlin, a senator from Maine, was nominated for vice president. In June, the Democrats met in Baltimore and nominated Stephen Douglas for president and Herschel Johnson, a Georgia Unionist, for vice president. Both parties campaigned vigorously, and on November 6th, the voters went to the polls. The nation elected Abraham Lincoln President of the United States. He had carried every northern state.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, our assignment is going to be posting in today's forum, and in your post, I want you to answer the following 4 questions in a paragraph. Think of these as sentence starters or ideas of things to include in your paragraph about the early life of Abraham Lincoln. For instance, how long did he go to school and what did he learn? Where and why did he get the nickname Honest Abe? That's something that you can find in the video. Did Lincoln succeed at everything that he did, or were there times that he failed? And if so, what were some of his successes? What were some of his failures? And what were some of the lessons he learned from those successes and failures? And for this one, I also want you to find one thing that you learned in the video about Abraham Lincoln's early life that you had not previously known. Now, just like all of our forums, you first need to post your own answer, and you can then get up to 2 points each time you reply to one of your classmates. And there's no limit to the amount of times that you can reply, but I want you to remember that we're all growing and learning together, so please be respectful in your replies. You guys have been awesome with the conversations that you've been able to generate in the past, so I want you to keep that up as we learn about the 16th President of the United States, Mr. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to reading your responses.